I was beaten up because I was different, so I've built a place where I can heal. Welcome to Marwen.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. And today we're talking about a fairly unknown movie, at least in my circles. But I feel like it's a good one to approach as far as storytelling in a very different way.
Today's movie discussion is Welcome to Marwen, starring Steve Carell, and it is based on a true story of someone dealing with the after effects of a brutal attack, including PTSD and trying to face the trauma while court stuff is still happening and he still has to face his attackers.
One of the things that really drew me to this movie was the fact that they were using PTSD and it wasn't a vet. And in fact, the horrors of war almost ended up being a safe place for this character in the imaginings of World War II battlefields in Europe and that kind of thing. A lot of the PTSD depiction that you see throughout the world and throughout Hollywood is veteran-based. And it's important to acknowledge that it's not exclusive to veterans by any means.
The characters in this are very interesting because you have the real world characters, but then you have the doll characters that he has created based on those people. And it was a very interesting outlook because most people would look at a situation like that and get creeped out and be weirded out by what he's doing. But we can see the character choices of the people around him. They're very empathetic to his situation.
The one character that felt funky to me was Nicole, was the new neighbor. She just rolled with stuff in a very interesting way that, like, oh, by the way, here's a very sexy character that I made up that's about you. And she's like, sounds good.
I did find that a little bit weird, but then I had to remember that she established early on that she knew about his case. And then I think in one particular scene, they showed that she had a son who had died. I think part of the purpose in that was showing that she is familiar with recovering from trauma, some of maybe the mental difficulties, mental disabilities associated with different kinds of things. I think it set it up for her to be a little bit more empathetic, but it was a very subtext choice. This is one of those movies you really have to pay attention to get a lot of those details. Otherwise, it's just weird. There is one character that I did find very interesting because it crossed over from doll reality to real reality. And that was the Belgian witch named Deja.
Yeah, I thought the name correlation there with Deja and PTSD, deja vu, these are almost synonymous, and the medicine that that she was also representing, that he was addicted to. You can't have a story without a villain, so he was kind of in his own little world, attaching her to the villain in his own life, which was in part the trauma and in part the addiction.
This is one of those visual things that works out really well in film storytelling because they were able to show the pills and they used the same color for the doll's hair and for the doll's magic glove.
When we talk about the characters, I think it's important to address who the main characters were, who the secondary characters were, and the main character, obviously, Mark. Secondary characters, mostly it was just Nicole and the dolls. We know Mark is the one who goes through the plot arc of finishing this court case, of addressing his addiction, of getting his art on display, those kinds of things. And the dolls had plot arcs where they came to understand certain parts about him. But a lot of the rest of the characters that kind of tread the line between secondary and tertiary characters didn't really have plot arcs.
They were there very much as support characters. This is a very one-person-centered story.
Kind of anticipated the neighbor Nicole changing a little bit, just like she has a new look at life because of something that Mark said or did or whatever. I thought it was interesting that they led us to kind of believe that she would change somehow, and then she didn't.
The plot for this, the structure of this story is very interesting because it's a little bit like a story within a story, but it's only within his mind. It plays out more like a metaphor for his own internal struggles rather than an actual story that we're being told. There's no arcing plot of the inner story. It's just addressing all of the different little pieces that he encounters in his real life.
Yeah, in Princess Bride, there was a very obvious outer story being affected by the inner story, where the kid grows and learns to like this book even though it's a kissing book. In this one, it's kind of the inverse, where the outer world just kind of happens, but the inner world becomes a reflection of that outer world. So you have a direction shift, but it's still that very clear two different plots, two different storylines that are interconnected.
As for the structure, it's kind of a 4-act structure. It can be broken down into introduction, development, twist, and conclusion. And this is a really common one that lines up with the theme of this story, which is the man versus self story, where he is dealing with his trauma, he's dealing with his addictions. There's no actual villain. The doll villain is just a representation of his internal conflict.
Yeah, in this particular type of story, it's more popular in the East, the 4-act structure, than it is really here, but I feel like it really applies well because you have the character goals that drive the story. It's not Voldemort has to be defeated, the Empire has to be taken down. It's not an external thing that the hero is called to accomplish. It's more of a let's get to know the character and develop what really are the problems here. Give it a little bit of a twist, which is why we're covering this section of the man versus self, this part of his life. And then you have the conclusion.
The inciting action is in this movie. There's no real, defined, this is it. This is the inciting action. I think the closest you could get to an inciting action in this is when the neighbor moves in. She is the catalyst for him getting the courage to change and to really address his problems instead of hiding from them.
If you look at this story in the it was based on a true story kind of thing, there are a lot of ways to tell this story. I think the most obvious one is starting with the attack. And then you kind of can have a bit of a whodunit, but they started with someone moving in, something a lot smaller, something a lot less dramatic in his life, and the beginning of the end instead of the beginning of the problem, which is an interesting choice for this. And I think it works especially in the true to life, the healing part of the story, the actual conquering of the villain, which is the trauma.
With where they chose to start it, the specific piece of his story that they chose to address was very interesting, and it made for a very thought-provoking film.
When it comes to the world building based on a true story can be a bit of a difficulty because yes, it's our world because it's based on a true story. And I think where this story really shined was the inner world building.
The inner story within Welcome to Marwen really needed the world building. It needed, some reasoning and an established storyline around the Witch of Belgium that was created based on no particular person in his life. They established that Deja is the one who is bringing back all of the Nazis in the doll story. She's the one bringing them all back to life. They never truly die. They're always there. So it's this fairly good world building for a piece of a story that occurred only in someone's mind.
And I think a key part of that was the fact that even though Marwen, this town, is the main point of the inner world, we didn't start there. We started outside with him encountering Nazis, and then they make it to town. We can get introduced to the town as another character is being introduced to it. And that was a lot of how they released any of the relevant information, was dolls talking to other dolls. Then we can get insight into the outer world without characters talking unnaturally to each other.
Overall, the choice of the storytelling technique was a very interesting one. I liked what they did with it, even though I found the movie to be just a little bit boring. It's not exactly my taste in movies. The concepts and the way they chose to tell his story, very well done.
I spent way too much time, and I still haven't concluded, trying to figure out if the uncanny valley was intentional or not. We're supposed to like these dolls, but it was creepy, but it was like the only way you could use uncanny valley in a way that would make sense.
I think it was intentional because the one doll that they chose to make a little less uncanny valley was Deja, who had the most connection to the real world. Even Hoagie had, I think, very intentional moments of Uncanny Valley to represent that it is very much a doll there. Like near the end where, he gets confronted at a church and he stands up and he just turns his head around like an owl. It was very Uncanny Valley. But then you had Deja that never really had that. She had a lot of smoother motions in how her arms moved, how she moved. Even her face was a little bit more realistic and less in that uncanny valley. I thought that was a great visual choice to represent that this particular doll has more connection to the real world. She is more real than any of the other ones.
So I feel like if you liked it, if you didn't, this is still a good movie to look at and to study, especially if you're looking at doing some sort of a memoir story. Next up, we have something that I think Lee liked a little bit more because it was more in her murder mystery vibe.
Next story, we will be talking about Glass Onion. When it comes to Welcome to Marwen, it is a good reminder to just tell our stories, whatever those stories are, and
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.